The lantern threw a pale circle onto the frozen ground, and she stood in the middle of it like a woman who had already made her decision before she was fully awake. 2 in the morning, maybe, the kind of cold that does not announce itself. It simply arrives and stays, pressing against the sod walls, creeping under the barn door, settling into the joints of a person's hands. The Kansas sky overhead was enormous and starless, low clouds swallowing the moon whole, and the prairie beyond the fence line was so dark, it felt like standing at the edge of something with no bottom. She had not planned to be here. She had been asleep, or close enough to it, when something pulled her up through the layers of rest and set her upright on the edge of her cot. Not a sound exactly, not an alarm. More like a change in pressure. The way a room feels different when the weather is about to turn. She had learned over the past year and a half to pay attention to that feeling. She had pulled on her coat and her boots, and taken the lantern off its hook, and walked to the barn without thinking it all the way through. That was just how it worked by now. The barn door swung open, and they came, not in a rush, not in a panic. They moved the way water moves when you tip a vessel, steady, inevitable, purposeful. They flowed past her boots one after another, 34 of them, and not one of them made a sound that carried. Their paws were silent on the hard ground. Their eyes, when they caught the lantern light for just a moment, were sharp and bright and entirely certain of where they were going. She did not call them. She did not lead them. She simply held the lantern and watched them go. They moved in a loose, rippling column toward the far end of the settlement, toward the low, broad silhouette of the communal grain shed that sat 200 yards off, past the pressed fence line, past the dead garden rows, out into the dark. The largest of them, a scarred, barrel-chested tabby she thought of as the old general, was not at the front. He was moving along the flank, unhurried, like a man who knows the outcome of a thing before it begins. She stood very still for a long moment. Then she set the lantern down on the fence post, crossed her arms against the cold, and waited. She did not know yet what they had heard, or smelled, or sensed in the way that animals sense things a person cannot. She only knew that in 18 months of watching them, she had never seen them move like this, unified, quiet, deliberate, every one of 34 animals oriented toward the same dark point on the horizon. Something was happening out there in that grain shed, and whatever it was, her cats already knew. The cold settled deeper around her, while the last cat disappeared into the dark, and she stood at the fence post with her arms folded tight, and let her mind do what it always did when her hands had nothing to hold. It went backward. She had been 22 when she filed on the claim, 22 years old, and carrying a tin box with a latch she had bent back into shape twice, which held every cent she had earned in 2 years of boiling other women's linens and stitching buttonholes by lamplight until her eyes ached and her fingers were stiff as dried leather. The land office man had looked at her the way men looked at her in those days, with a kind of waiting skepticism, as if expecting her to change her mind before she reached the door. She had not changed her mind. She had signed her name in full, taken her receipt, and walked out into the Kansas afternoon, feeling both terrified and entirely certain. The sod house had been 4 walls and a dirt floor when she inherited the unfinished claim from a neighbor who had given up and gone east. She had chinked the gaps herself with wet clay and dry grass, packed it tight with a flat stick, replastered the same north wall 3 times before the wind stopped finding a way through. She had dug the root cellar alone over the course of a single brutal summer week. 2 feet down, 3, 4, her shoulders screaming by evening, the soil fighting her every inch until she had a cool, dark space where she could keep her turnips and dried beans through the worst cold. She had mended the fence line, post by post, resetting each one with her own weight, thrown against a tamping bar, until the whole eastern boundary was something she could trust. The work was not extraordinary. It was simply what a person did when the land was theirs, and no one else was coming to do it for them. The first cat had arrived in February, the winter she turned 23. She had heard something against the door during a sleet storm, a sound that was not quite wind, too irregular for wind, and when she opened it a crack, he had come through sideways, like a creature who had given up expecting kindness, but could not stop trying. One ear was gone down to a stub, healed rough and long ago, and he was thin enough that she could have counted his ribs through the dark stripes on his coat. She gave him the last of the salt pork fat she had been saving to grease her boot seams. He ate it without looking at her and then sat down beside the stove as if he had always lived there and she was the newcomer. She had not gone looking for the others, but after that first one, it seemed the word went out somehow, the way it does among strays and wanderers who have learned to read a place from the outside and know which doors are worth trying. They came the way strays always do, not all at once, not in a flood, but in ones and twos, spaced out across the months like sentences in a long and careful letter. Each arrival was its own small story. A tortoiseshell female with a kinked tail, found wedged beneath a fence post on the northwest corner of the claim in early March, shivering so hard she seemed to be made entirely of vibration. A pair of half-grown tabbies someone had dropped from a wagon on the Cottonwood Road. She had seen the wagon slow, had seen the burlap bundle hit the ditch, and she had walked the quarter-mile to the road without hurrying, because hurrying would have spooked them, and she had crouched in the dead grass and waited until they came to her. That was the thing people never understood about her and the cats. They assumed she had simply stopped saying no, had let sentiment soften her into carelessness, had opened her door to anything that scratched at it. That was not how it happened, not once. Every single time she watched first, she would observe a new cat for days if she needed to. Note whether it startled at sudden sound, whether it held its ground near the barn or retreated to the tree line, whether it ate without aggression when others were nearby. She was building something, even if she couldn't have named it in those early months. She was building a working population, the way a careful woman builds a root cellar, each layer deliberate, each choice made with an eye toward what the whole structure would need to hold. She traded dried fish from the mill, 2 weeks' worth of mending in exchange for a sack of salt cod scraps that the miller's wife would otherwise have buried, and she trapped cottontails along the creek bank, small snares set in the evenings, checked at first light. The kitchen scraps she stretched with water and stale cornmeal when she had to. There were lean weeks when she fed the cats better than she fed herself, and she never once resented it because she understood what she was investing in, even if no one else did. By summer, she had 14. By September, 21. A gray Tom came with a broken swagger and a loud opinion about everything. A silent black female arrived in October, already pregnant, and delivered 7 kittens in the hayloft, 5 of whom survived the cold snap that followed. She kept 4 of those. The arithmetic of it was never random. 34 by the time the leaves went entirely. 34 cats who had learned that this place was safe, that the woman who moved through it would not startle them or strike them or drive them off into the cold. 34 cats who had over 18 months of small and consistent kindnesses come to regard her barn as theirs and her presence as something reliable in a world that had offered them very little reliability at all. What she had not yet known, what none of them knew, was that all of that patience was about to be asked to prove itself. The mill was the worst of it. She had ridden the 2 miles into the settlement on a Tuesday in early November, a sack of dried corn balanced across her saddle, and a short list of winter trades in her coat pocket. The morning was iron gray, the kind that settled into the collar and stayed. She tied her horse at the post and went inside, and the conversation was already in motion before she reached the counter. The kind of conversation that doesn't stop when someone walks in, because stopping would admit they'd been overheard. He was holding court near the grain scales, stout, barrel-chested, with the confident bearing of a man who had never once doubted his own opinions. He had his thumbs hooked into his suspenders, and his audience arranged in a loose half-circle around him. 2 men from the eastern claims, a woman waiting on flour, the miller himself not laughing, but not doing anything to interrupt either. 34, he said, drawing the number out for effect. I counted the tracks in her yard myself last spring. 34 cats. Now I have had dogs that earned their keep, horses that earned their keep, even a sorry mule that earned its keep. But I have never once met a cat worth feeding through a Kansas winter. He let that land, then added, what she's running out there is a beggar's zoo, nothing more. The laughter was not loud, but it was wide, the kind that moves through a room like a low wave. She set her corn on the counter and did not look up. He wasn't finished. Later, at the communal grain shed, where each family had come to confirm their share of the autumn wheat stockpile before the hard freeze set in, he made sure the larger audience heard the same sermon. She would starve herself, he told them, feeding strays that would steal your scraps and give nothing back. The whole settlement was watching, and she could feel it. Not hostility exactly, but something close to it. The particular discomfort people feel when they suspect someone they know might be doing something foolish. Even the grain keeper, a stout, white-haired woman with capable hands and a long record of practical judgment, gave her a look across the shed that was not unkind but was unmistakably doubtful. A slow study, the kind reserved for questionable measurements. She accepted her grain allocation, folded her receipt into her coat pocket, and said nothing worth repeating. A brief thank you. A nod. She was not small about it. She did not shrink or flush or look at her boots. She simply let the noise move past her, the way creek water moves past a fence post. Present, noted, and gone. But she heard every word. She heard it on the ride home, the wind picking up from the north and the sky going the color of old pewter. She heard it as she forked hay into the barn and watched 34 pairs of eyes catch the lantern light and blink back at her from the shadows. She heard it, and she kept feeding them. The morning after the grain shed visit, she was up before light, not because she had to be, the traps would wait an hour, but because the cold had sharpened overnight into something serious. And serious cold meant the small game would be moving early, pushing toward warmth and any last forage before the ground locked up completely. She knew this the way she knew when the well rope needed rewrapping, not from being told, but from paying attention long enough that the land had simply told her itself. She pulled on her coat, took the trap line off its peg, and walked the fence row in the gray pre-dawn, with frost crunching soft, and even under her boots. 6 traps. She had set them the evening before along the low scrub near the creek bend, where rabbits and field mice ran their habitual paths, with the confidence of animals who believe themselves alone in the world. She was not alone in the world, but she moved quietly enough that it amounted to the same thing. 4 catches that morning, 2 rabbits, 2 large field mice. Not a spectacular haul, but steady. The kind of steady she had learned to value above almost everything else. She carried them back to the barn. What happened next was not dramatic. There was no ritual to it, no ceremony. She parceled out the cleaned portions the way a good accountant parcels out figures, with precision and without waste. The dried fish she traded for at the mill came in rough slabs. She broke these apart, with practiced hands, into portions sized by the cat she was feeding, knowing which animals were older and needed softening, which were young and bold and would eat anything offered. She moved down the row of feeders, shallow tin pans she had hammered flat herself from salvaged cans, and the cats came to her in the unhurried, self-possessed way of animals that trust without fawning. And then she simply stood back and watched them work, because that is what they did once fed. They worked. It was not play, or not entirely. 3 of the younger tabbies had positioned themselves along the base of the fence line the moment the light grew strong enough to be useful, and she had seen this pattern enough times to know what it meant. They were hunting. The fence post bases were riddled with mouse runs, packed hard with use, and the cats knew every one. She watched one tabby, a battle-scarred thing with a torn left ear who had shown up the previous spring, barely weighing more than a boot, drop into a low, boneless stillness over a particular gap in the grass. The patience was absolute, then swift as a thought, the motion. Clean. Finished. She had been watching this for over a year, cataloging it really the way a person catalogs anything that matters, quietly, consistently, without announcing the record she was keeping. They were not decoration. They were not strays eating her out of house and home. They were 34 reasons, working the fence line in the pale October sun. The harvest came in lean and honest, the way a hard year always does. No pretending, no softening the numbers. 3 weeks of hauling, hand sorting, and careful measurement, and when the last bushel was weighed and tallied, the settlement's grainkeeper called the total what it was: enough if nothing was wasted, not enough if anything was. 7 families, 1 shed, 1 winter. She had helped carry sacks on the last day, her arms aching by afternoon, her boots caked in the pale dust of threshed wheat. The grainkeeper, a compact, deliberate woman in her 60s, who ran the communal ledger with the precision of someone who had learned the hard way what imprecision costs, had double-checked every seam on every sack before the shed door was latched and locked. There was a particular efficiency to how she moved through the shed that afternoon, the lantern swinging in a slow arc over the stacked stores, her expression unreadable but careful. The kind of careful that means a person is doing arithmetic behind their eyes. The lock went on. The key went into the grainkeeper's apron pocket. And that was that. It was 4 days later when the older woman came walking down the road at dusk, not hurrying exactly, but moving with purpose, and turned in at the sod house without calling ahead the way most neighbors did. She sat at the table without being asked, and folded her hands and said quietly that there had been signs. Mouse droppings along the south wall, inside, a smell, and 1 family, she did not say which, had found a corner of their own private sack chewed clean through during the night. Not in the shed, in their own barn, but the shed backed against a stretch of tall grass that ran unbroken clear to the creek, and she had walked that grass herself 2 mornings running. And the runs were there, packed hard, not fresh either. This had been building. She listened without moving. She said nothing that would alarm and nothing that would dismiss. She said only that she had heard and that she was grateful to know. After the older woman left, she stood at the window until the last light went out of the sky. The shed was 200 yards north and slightly east, just visible as a dark rectangle against the grass when the moon was right. She had never had reason to watch it before. Now she began, each evening, when the chores were done and the cats were settled in the barn with their scraps, she would stand at the south-facing window for a long spell before she slept. Long enough for her eyes to adjust, long enough to see what moved and what didn't. She did not tell anyone she was doing this. There was no point in raising worry until worry was warranted, but she started sleeping lighter, left the barn door unlatched at the top, the way she did in summer when she wanted air through. Just the top latch, just in case. It was a small thing. She told herself it was a small thing. The cats moved through the dark outside, and she listened. The cold came down hard the second week of November, not the gradual cooling she had grown used to, the kind that gave a person time to bank the fire higher and pull the second quilt from the chest. This was a different kind of cold, the kind that arrived between one day and the next, like a door swung shut, sealing off everything that had come before it. She woke the first morning of it to frost on the inside of the window glass, and a stillness over the land so complete it pressed against her ears. The creek to the east, she knew, would have gone quiet. The low ground along the abandoned claim, where the old Harker family had given up and moved on 2 springs prior, leaving behind a half-collapsed dugout and a cellar with a broken door, that ground would have frozen over on its surface, shallow and sudden. She knew what cold like that did to the things that lived in the creek bottom. She had read enough of the land by now to understand. It pushed them up and out. She did not sleep well those nights. She told herself it was the cold working through the sod walls, or the wind finding the gap above the north window she had been meaning to pack with rags. She lay in the dark and listened to the cats move in the barn the way she always did now, reading their sounds the way she might read weather. Low murmur, shifting straw, the occasional complaint of a restless one near the door. Ordinary, ordinary, ordinary. And then, on the third night of the cold snap, something changed. She was not fully asleep when it happened. She was in that thin gray space just beneath waking, where sounds still reach you and your body has not yet let go. She heard the barn go quiet, not the quiet of cats settled and sleeping. She knew that sound, soft and formless. This was a different quiet, a gathered quiet, a quiet with weight behind it. She sat up. Outside, the moon had moved to the west, and the land was pale and shadowless. She could see the faint outline of the barn, the fence line, the dark rectangle of the grain shed 200 yards north. Nothing moved that she could see, but inside the barn, she could feel it more than hear it. Something was happening. A current of attention, a collective electric stillness that raised the small hairs along her forearms. She had heard that sound once before, months ago, when a fox had come too close to the barn on a summer night. But that had been brief, a few cats, a short burst. This was all of them, all 34, and it was not brief. She was already pulling on her boots before she understood fully what she was doing. She reached for her coat on the peg. Her hands were steady. The cold hit her face when she opened the door, sharp as a slap. The barn waited 20 feet ahead. The grain shed waited beyond it in the dark. She walked toward the barn. The barn door swung open under her hand. They came out like water finding its level, not scrambling, not frantic, but purposeful, fluid, moving with a collective intention that made her breath catch in her chest. 34 cats poured past her boots in a low, nearly silent tide. Tabbies and gray streaks and the big amber Tom, who had come to her, half-starved and mean-eyed 18 months ago, and was now something closer to a general than a stray. They did not scatter. They moved north. She followed at a distance, lantern raised. The cold pressed in from all sides. Her boots found the frost-hardened ground, and each step crunched faintly. But the cats ahead of her made almost no sound at all. She could see them spread as they moved, not in a pack, but in a kind of loose, intelligent formation. The fastest runners already pulling ahead, the heavier, slower ones fanning out to the flanks. She had watched them hunt before, one by one in the tall grass at the fence line, and she had understood then that they were built for this. But she had never seen them move together. The sight of it lodged somewhere behind her sternum and stayed there. The grain shed rose up out of the dark. It was a low, wide structure built from rough-cut timber and salvaged planking. The walls not entirely flush. Gaps at the base where the boards had warped through summer heat and dried out uneven. She could hear it now as she drew close. A skittering, restless, rustling sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. From inside the walls themselves, a sound that told her exactly what she had already suspected when her cats first stirred. The first cat slipped under the gap board without hesitating, then another, then 6 at once. Then the rest in a long quicksilver pour, flattening themselves to clear the gap and disappearing into the dark interior, like they had always known this moment was coming. Like every cold morning, she had carried out scraps and dried fish, and set the tin pan down in the straw, had been preparation for exactly this. She stood at the door. She did not open it. She did not go in. This was not her work to do. It was theirs, and she understood that well enough to stay back. What she could do was this. She lifted the lantern higher and held it steady, throwing light across the shed's front wall, keeping the darkness from pressing in at the door, keeping herself present as a kind of anchor at the threshold. From inside came sounds she would not have been able to describe to anyone who hadn't already known what 34 cats working in earnest could do. Movement, concentrated and relentless, swift purpose, a kind of focused, living energy that hummed through the planking under her palm when she pressed it flat against the door. The wheat was in there, the only clean wheat left in 7 families' worth of winter. She held the lantern. She waited. She did not move. The cold came down harder past midnight. She felt it in her knuckles first. The hand holding the lantern going stiff around the bale. The other hand pressed flat against the door plank, losing feeling at the fingertips. She shifted her weight from boot to boot and breathed slow, watching the thin line of light at the bottom of the shed door flicker with movement she could not see, could only guess at from the sounds. And the sounds changed as the hour turned. At first, it had been all swift urgency, a concentrated, bristling energy that came through the wood like something you could almost read with your palm. But that sharpened into something steadier, more methodical, as though the first wild charge had broken the swarm's direction, and now what remained was the patient, unhurried work of finishing. She knew that rhythm. She had watched a single cat work a field mouse into a corner with the same quality of patience, utterly certain, unwilling to be rushed. The first one slipped back out past her ankles sometime around what she reckoned was the first hour. She knew without needing to look which one it was by the weight of the body brushing her boot, the particular way it wound once around her leg before sitting down beside her in the dirt. She crouched and ran her hands along the spine, down the ribs, over each leg in turn. Whole. Good. She let out a breath she hadn't fully acknowledged she'd been holding. Others followed, not all at once. 2, then 1, then a pause, then 3 more sliding out in a loose cluster and scattering against her shins. Each time she went down to a knee in the frozen mud and checked them the same way, hands working by feel in the poor lantern light. She knew them by the ridge of a healed nick, by the breadth of a shoulder, by the particular softness behind one set of ears, and the wary, don't-linger manner of another. 17 out, then 21. She counted by touch. The sounds inside the shed grew quieter. Not absent, she could still hear movement, still feel the faint tremor of cats working in the far corners. But the frantic high energy had bled away, like water draining, replaced by something more like a room being swept clean in the final patient passes. She fed oil into the lantern from the small flask she'd thought to bring, keeping the light steady. 26 cats sat, or paced, or simply leaned against her in the dirt. 8 still inside. She rested her hand on the nearest warm back and waited. The cold didn't matter so much when she had that. 34 heartbeats she knew, some counted against her palm, some still moving in the dark, doing what she had always believed they could. The shed was going quiet. The night was going quiet with it. The last cat came out just past 4 in the morning. She felt it before she heard it, a change in the quality of the silence, the way a room feels different when it finally empties after a long night of work. The sounds from inside the shed had been fading in gradual stages, like a fire burning itself down through its last fuel, and then there was simply nothing. No scrabbling, no rush of small bodies, no high, urgent rustle of grain sacks shifting under weight. Just the cold and the dark and the creak of the shed's timber frame settling against the wind. She lifted her lantern and stepped through the door. The first thing she saw was the floor. It told everything, the way a field tells everything in the morning after rain. What came through, how many, which way they moved. The packed dirt was marked and churned from wall to wall, a record written in the passage of hundreds of small feet, cats and rats both, crossing and recrossing in patterns she could read, like a page of text. Along the far wall, near the low ventilation gap, the churning was deepest. That was where they had gone out. She moved the lantern in a slow arc and looked at the wheat. The main stores, the 7 large burlap sacks, stacked 3 deep along the center wall, the ones representing the bulk of what 7 families would eat and plant come spring, were solid. She pressed each one with her palm and felt the firm, dry resistance of undisturbed grain. She worked the tied necks open on 2 of them and ran her hand through the contents, checking for moisture, for the particular sour, sharp smell that would mean contamination. Clean. Both of them clean. On the outer edge of the stack, 1 sack had been breached. Low on the side, gnawed through in a ragged crescent where the rats had found their first purchase before the cats arrived. She untied it, assessed the damage with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had spent 3 years deciding what could be salvaged and what could not, and set it apart from the others. A single sack. She would deal with it properly come morning. She stood then, in the middle of the shed, and held her lantern up. The wheat. All of it. Or close enough to all of it that the difference would not break a family. 7 households, 7 winter stores. She thought about what one full night of an unchecked swarm would have done here, the weight of that possibility settling through her slowly, like cold water finding the bottom of a vessel. She had not known, not precisely, until this moment. She knew now. Outside she could hear her cats beginning to settle, the small sounds of creatures finding their rest after hard work. The shed smelled of grain and cold earth and effort. She stayed a little longer. The lantern burned steady. The lantern was long cold by the time the first pale seam of light opened over the eastern flats. She had moved outside sometime before dawn, not from weariness exactly, but because the shed had given her everything it had to give, and she was ready for open air. She sat on the top rail of the fence post nearest the shed door, her coat buttoned to her chin, her breath visible in small measured clouds. Several of the cats had found her. 2 were in her lap. 1 was draped across her left shoulder like a living shawl. The rest lay in loose arrangements along the fence rail and at her boots, not restless, not watchful. Settled, the way creatures settle when the night's work is fully behind them. The first footsteps she heard were unhurried, purposeful. The grainkeeper moved with the habit of long mornings, a ring of keys at her hip, a shawl pulled close. She stopped when she saw the shed door already standing open. She stood very still. Then she looked at the woman on the fence rail, and at the cats, and back at the open door, and she walked inside without a word. She was in there a long time. When she came back out, she stood in the doorway and looked at the woman with an expression that had passed beyond surprise into something considerably older and steadier. She said something low. The woman on the fence heard it. She nodded once. Word moved the way it always moves in small settlements, fast and sideways, carried on the particular frequency of people who share a winter supply and know what that means. By the time the sun had cleared the horizon a full hand's width, 3 families had come. Then 2 more. They went into the shed as the grainkeeper had gone, quietly, and came out as she had come out. Some looked at the floor a long time. Some looked at the woman on the fence. A few came near enough to speak, not speeches, not proclamations, just the honest language of people who are looking at something they underestimated and are willing to say so plainly. The last to arrive was the stout man. He came alone, hands in his coat pockets, jaw set in the way of a person who has been thinking hard since before sunrise. He went into the shed. He was in there longer than most. When he came out, he walked to the fence rail directly, without hesitating, and he looked at the cats, and then at the woman, and then at the shed floor again, as if checking his own arithmetic. He said nothing for a long moment. Around her boots, the cats moved in easy figure 8s, unbothered by the morning's gathering, or the stout man's silence, or the weight of everything that hung, unspoken between them. He reached into his coat and drew out a folded grain sack. He held the grain sack out across the top rail without ceremony, the way a man returns a borrowed tool. Matter of fact, straightforward, wanting no fuss made of it. She took it from his hands. He looked at the cats once more, and then at the shed, and then at her directly. "Those cats of yours," he said. He stopped, started again. "I said some things about them that weren't fair. About you too, I expect." The jaw was set still, but the voice had something honest working in it, the kind of honesty that costs a person something to produce. "Grain's clean, all of it. That's owing to you." She nodded once, not coldly, not warmly, just the nod of a woman who has heard the thing she needed to hear and has no interest in making anyone grovel for having said it late. There was no satisfaction in watching a man struggle with himself. There was only the clean morning and the shed full of saved wheat, and the weight of a grain sack back in her own hands where it belonged. He touched his hat brim and walked back across the frost toward his claim without another word. She watched him go. The grainkeeper came to her before she had climbed down from the rail. The older woman moved with the unhurried authority of someone who has kept accounts for a long time and knows exactly what the ledger says. She stood beside the fence and looked up with clear, steady eyes. "First pick of the clean stores," she said. "That's what the settlement owes you. Come whenever you're ready." It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a ceremony. It was an entry in the ledger, offered plainly, and that was more than enough. "I'll come tomorrow," she said. "Early, if that suits." "Early suits," the older woman said, and that was all. The gathering dispersed the way morning gathers disperse, slowly, by ones and twos, until the barnyard held only the thin, cold light and the sound of someone's oxen moving in a far pen. She climbed down from the fence rail and stood in the frost-stiffened grass, the borrowed grain sack folded under one arm, and looked once more at the grain shed door standing open to the winter air. 34 cats wound around her boots and her ankles in easy, unhurried loops, the way water finds the low places in ground it knows well. She bent and ran one hand along the long gray back of the one who had moved first in the dark, and he leaned briefly into her palm without breaking stride. Then she straightened, turned her face toward the southeast and the low sod walls of her own claim, and walked home across the prairie. The frost pale beneath her boots, the sky enormous and pale above, and the quiet certainty settling in her chest like grain settling into a clean, dry bin. It had always been enough to know. Now everyone else knew too.